Hello, and welcome again. Let's begin by talking about consciousness and being able to communicate with your higher self. There is consciousness at many levels of existence. Some will go so far as to say that even a stone has enough consciousness to exist, to maintain its shape, and to resist change to that shape. Certainly plants have consciousness. That's been demonstrated in the past in experiments by electronically monitoring certain plants in the presence of persons who have treated them well or who have not harmed them, and by measuring and comparing the reaction of these plants to their very different response when they are in the presence of persons who have caused harm to them or to other plants near them. In this experiment, a number of plants were placed near each other in a room. They were wired to electronically monitor any measurable impulses that they might give off. A person then walked into the room with some sort of torch, propane perhaps, or something similar, and turned the flame on one or more of the plants. That person then left the room. Later, a number of other persons walked through the area where the plants were kept without any unusual activity being measured. The person who had earlier burned some of the plants then walked through the room again, and the monitoring devices registered a very noticeable reaction that was not present when any of the other persons had entered the area. We all know, too, that animals have consciousness. Among them, most people would agree that the one with which we are most familiar would be our own human consciousness. Nevertheless, there are sufficient examples of unusual levels of human consciousness to give thinking persons reason to believe that some humans have the ability to manifest levels of consciousness that seem to defy popular understanding of what actually constitutes human consciousness. At times, there are some people who experience what many would describe as levels of awareness or consciousness wherein they are able to be conscious of, and for some, able to communicate with, unseen higher positive forces in higher realms. Even within those higher realms, there continue to be various levels of existence or awareness or consciousness. The obvious question at this point would be to ask if such a thing as this level of communication can be learned or developed within oneself, given one's current level of consciousness and understanding. It might be interesting to know that there are some people who have actually accomplished that. Some of them began at a certain point in their lives to move in that direction by manifesting an interest in reading books on esoteric subjects, or seeing movies that touched on such subjects. Other people have been introduced to that way of thinking by their friends or their family. Those who are seriously interested in such things will find that their reading, their thinking, and even their way of living can cause them to be drawn gradually closer to a way of seeing things, a way of understanding things that can open their minds and hearts in a very positive way. It can actually bring about a more humanitarian outlook on life, a more tolerant and compassionate way of considering others even. Some people have noticed that slowly within themselves it even brought about a more planetary outlook on life. It can create within us a desire to approach life in such a way that we begin to look less and less at serving self and more at serving others, serving humanity, serving God. Although it may involve many years of slow positive change, that kind of thinking and living are almost inevitable manifestations in the lives of those who have learned to open their minds, their hearts, and their consciousness to the influence of higher positive forces. I stress the word positive. For many, this will mean, through meditation and other methods, becoming closer to their own intuitive sense, their conscience, their still small voice within, their higher self, their own master within. For some of these persons, there may be somewhere along the way the beginning of a feeling, like a wonderful tingle or shiver up and down the spine, that we've already mentioned in the previous videos in regard to communication from the higher self, or even other higher positive forces. This is often the way that our higher self may initially open the door to a level of communication that can be the beginning of great blessings. The communication in that manner can begin in meditation and may eventually grow to mental, verbal communication, as has also been previously indicated. As our level of understanding and our level of commitment to our service continue to grow, our level of spirituality grows also. During that time, when there is a period of such communication and spiritual growth, it may be worthwhile for you to begin to consult your guide, usually your higher self, regarding more and more of your personal decisions, not regarding things that others may want you to ask, but about decisions that you need to make on a day-to-day and perhaps even on an hour-to-hour basis. Don't ask about those things which would be a frivolous use of your guide and his guidance and of this blessing that's been given to you. But simply ask about those decisions which you need to consider for yourself throughout each day. It will bring about a greater closeness and rapport between you and your guide that wisdom would indicate should be increasingly encouraged. If you do not want or need that closeness, if you're not ready for it yet, or if your guide says or indicates in some way that it's too soon, then wait. Otherwise, increase it gradually as you receive your guide's approval. Remember, however, that we are all agents of free will, so you're not asking your guide for permission in any particular matter, but you are instead seeking guidance regarding which of the choices available to you would be recommended or suggested to you by your guide to be in your best interest from a spiritual point of view. It's also often done to seek to know, so that you may then therefore do the will of your unseen guide. In other words, let your will be done. For a great many of such people, the wonderful blessing of being able to communicate freely with their higher self, the Master within, throughout the balance of their lifetime, may be all that will be needed for them in this incarnation. A few, however, may need to complete the teachings that are to be given by the higher self and go on to additional teachings, perhaps from those who would be considered unseen ascended masters. Even that great blessing may not necessarily be the end of training and spiritual development for a few of these seekers. The importance of establishing communication with the higher self cannot be overemphasized, since, as you can see, it has the potential to lead to communication at even higher levels and with even greater benefit to your personal spiritual development and growth. Excuse me. We've talked a great deal about the higher self that's a part of each of us. Perhaps this is a good opportunity to talk about the opposite of the higher self, which is the negative part of ourselves that we must also learn to recognize and approach properly and carefully. Once communication with the higher self has been established, one continues over a period of time to work with the higher self. During the time that this is taking place, a point in time eventually comes when the lower self begins to make its presence known. It doesn't normally identify itself, but by careful observation you may begin to notice that there are times when answers that you receive do not seem to be in keeping with the high principles that you have come to identify with the normal answers that you receive from your higher self. Once that time has come, you must exercise great caution whenever you feel that there may be a question in your mind about the source of the information you receive. Excuse me. Pardon me. You have been given questions that you can ask to help you ascertain that the answers are dependable. For example, do you come in the Christ Spirit? Once that negative source has been identified, you can then take the necessary precautions to protect the integrity of the answers you receive. In addition, through a purposeful process of spiritual growth, you will eventually be able to brighten your own inner light to the degree and to the point that your lower self can no longer tolerate that light, and sometimes groaning, sometimes screaming in protest, it leaves you as you release it into the hands of those whose duty and authority it is to deal with it at that point in time. There is an example of this in the book, Brother of the Third Degree, as the negative spirit is released and leaves with a groan of protest. You must never attack the lower self or any being with light or in any other way. You may surround or fill yourself with light as a defense, but never for attack. When your inner light has grown sufficiently bright, the lower self will leave you of its own accord, and you will at that time release it into the proper hands, as indicated above and previously. Remember that this process also of brightening your inner light is not an overnight project. It takes a long time. Be willing to let such things take whatever time they need to take. For as long as we continue to seek to serve, and we do not return to the practice of giving a higher priority to seeking for self, which can allow the lower self to return, perhaps almost unnoticed, we can then continue to safely act as an instrument of our guide, our higher self, and others. Excuse me. It could continue thus throughout the remainder of one's life. Or it may be that one will eventually begin receiving instruction from a yet higher instructor or source, who then becomes the guide. That source would be within the hierarchical structure of higher level positive spirit guides. The concept of having a higher self and a lower self, both as a part of the same person, can be difficult for some to consider. Excuse me. Pardon me. If, however, you can accept the idea that we have a subconscious level of understanding, as well as a conscious level of understanding, then perhaps you've already accepted the fact that there are different levels of consciousness and existence. One of those levels, the conscious level self, is not necessarily aware of the subconscious, even though they are different aspects, or should we say even different parts of the same person. If you accept that such a thing can be possible, then perhaps you could further accept the idea that there is a higher self, a lower self, and a self that is aware at a conscious physical level of existence. Just as the conscious and the subconscious mind are perceived to be different, but still are the same person, perhaps you would be willing to concede that the concept of a higher, lower, and conscious level self could all coexist as different aspects, or perhaps different parts of the same single person. As we experience life on earth, especially if we have chosen the path of seeking spiritual growth and enlightenment, our levels of consciousness can grow in understanding, bringing about positive change in our lives and in our thinking and our living. Once again, this is information that is important enough to repeat. I will therefore restate that when these positive changes come about, and we grow spiritually so that the light within us then becomes bright enough, the lower aspect of ourselves will eventually make the decision to leave. When that time is right, we then release the lower self into the hands of those entities who have the duty and authority to deal with it. That is the manner in which this process is properly accomplished. This does not please the lower self, but when the light within us, as a natural process, becomes bright enough, it, meaning the lower self, cannot and will not stay. The higher self, or the master within, which some may also call the soul personality, is the sum total of this life and its experiences, as well as all of our past lives and their experiences, and therefore will express a level of understanding that is appropriate to that sum total for that particular individual. We do not all choose to make the same number of right decisions in our lifetimes here, and therefore that sum total for one person will not necessarily be the same as the sum total for another. In order to continue growing and learning, however, we choose to reincarnate here to add to our learning, our sum total that is, through these life experiences. The conscious level self has various opportunities to make decisions that some would call right decisions, or decisions that some would call wrong decisions, or decisions that are not of the highest nature. The more right decisions that are made, the more we grow as a conscious level person and as a higher level personality. The so-called wrong decisions are those decisions that are not part of the highest nature, or that are not of the highest nature, can theoretically hold us back. Yet, depending on where we happen to be in our personal spiritual development, it may play a part in actually teaching us from a different perspective, and therefore eventually helping us to learn the needed lesson. If we need to learn more completely a particular lesson, in other words, to be held back, so to speak, then it might be better if we make the decision that way, meaning incorrectly, in order to give us a little more time to learn to deal with the situation more perfectly when we meet it again. Excuse me. This is a very complex concept. In order to help us understand it better, perhaps this is a good point at which to say that it would actually be more accurate if we changed our terminology so that instead of saying that we make a right or a wrong decision, we might be better to say that our decisions can take us in one direction or another. One of those directions will take us to our eventual destination more directly. In other words, the positive situation. But if we've made the other decision, meaning maybe not necessarily the best one, then the reason for that is probably because we need the extra time to learn more perfectly the needed lesson, so that we will be adequately prepared when we do reach that eventual destination. Sadly, some will read that statement, or see that statement, or listen to that statement, and use it as an excuse to make a decision that's not the one that they know should be made. That would not be wise. We should do what we are reasonably able to do, and not look for excuses to procrastinate. This spirit guide, higher self, meaning the higher self or other spirit guides, the relationship with their student. Let me just say that again. The higher self / student relationship will continue to improve as we continue to maintain contact with and act as the instrument of the true source of all things, which by whatever name we use is still God. This careful, methodical progression of the student is tried and true, and will allow the seeker to work toward becoming an effective instrument of the higher positive forces. Even then, however, remember that regardless of what one comes to know over the years, it does not necessarily qualify one to be able to know where, when, or how to best teach such things to another. It all comes down to the fact that we can find no higher calling than to become an effective instrument of God, the true source of all things. Given that truth, many have asked why one would begin by seeking communication with the higher self, rather than directly with God. In response, let me say that from a purely mystical spiritual point of view, generally we would be wiser if we did not approach the Father directly as soon as we begin our journey on the path. This video and the others address the more respectful approach of dealing in the beginning with our own higher self. This part of us is also attuned to and is a part of the spark of God that lives within us all. For many of us, that level of contact will be sufficient in this lifetime. For some, a few others, they will take the next step when the higher self says it is time, or indicates that it is time, meaning the next step of working with other unseen guides, which could be one of those that we have at each shoulder, or others. For still fewer of those people, when the time comes, and it may take years, meaning from within that group, that select group, they might be introduced to a guide at a higher level still, and could begin to receive guidance from the Holy Spirit, symbolically represented by Beatrice in Dante's Paradiso. Perhaps a few others will go forward further still, through a planned hierarchy of other unseen guides, until the time comes when they have prepared themselves sufficiently that they are found to be ready. At that time they will not need to go to the Father. They will be invited by the Archangel, who takes them by the hand and brings them to the throne of the Father. There is a long and difficult path to that worthwhile destination. The end of that journey then opens the door to the beginning of yet another in His service. There may also be variations for different personalities, but generally this is the road that will be traveled by those few within the few who should consider themselves very, very, very blessed. Please don't misunderstand, however. The beloved Father has never, never turned away from a heartfelt prayer, a bowed head, or a bent knee, nor do I believe He ever will. However, for the sincere seeker on the mystical or spiritual path, who is willing to take the longest, most difficult road that eventually leads to the highest peak, an approach much like the one described here is to be sought. It is for that reason that I have taken this approach in these videos, so that you can understand the need for this particular approach. All of this, which has touched on so many things, is not meant to be a lecture or a sermon, but to simply point out for some what a few who have already passed this way on life's path may know already. That consciousness need not be, nor is it intended to be, static. It is intended, certainly in the case of human beings, that they at least have the opportunity to make the choice to be constantly evolving and growing mentally, psychically, mystically, and hopefully spiritually. Our consciousness can continue to grow far beyond what has been mentioned here, but be aware, as stated many times before, that such change, such growth, doesn't generally happen in a few days, or a few weeks, or a few months, or even a few years necessarily. It may even take many lifetimes. If I remind you of that fact 100 times, it will not be too many. So great is its importance. It is suspected, however, that most of those who hear this information and watch this video have already experienced significant previous preparation over many incarnations. If that were true, you probably wouldn't have sufficient interest in the subject to have watched this video and previous videos this far. By availing yourself of and using the information that is in this series of videos, and by utilizing the additional sources that are referenced here, you can begin your journey along the path. That journey can be a long and difficult one, and some may fall by the wayside, while others may simply become distracted by one or more of the many other aspects of our lives here and end up staying in that place in their lives without attempting to return to the path to finish their journey. By practicing the suggestions and principles outlined throughout this series of videos, and making these suggestions and principles a part of your daily living, you will find them to be of significant benefit, and they may also help you to avoid pitfalls along the way. Through all this long journey, the key is to persevere. The key is to persevere and not become discouraged and move away from the journey, or stop the journey, or be distracted on your journey. At least and certainly not for any period of time. You want to continue to persevere. That is the secret. That and incorporating into your life a little bit at a time each day the various concepts and principles that have been outlined in these videos. It should be stated at this point that when the time comes that these blessings begin to manifest in your own life, you may be pleased, and probably will be so pleased and excited that you'll want to tell everyone that you know, to share the news about your blessing with your family and friends. May I once again offer a word to the wise. Please be very cautious. Those whom you want to tell may not at all understand or be nearly as enthusiastic as you think that they will be. They may even possibly think that you've become a bit delusional, maybe more than a bit delusional, and may need to be committed, and perhaps that you're in league with some negative religious cult. These kinds of blessings are intended by those higher positive forces who give them to you to be very personal in their nature, and you may want to consider keeping them that way. I strongly encourage it. Speak to others of such things very selectively and judiciously, if at all. Let us now change topic somewhat and discuss the idea of mystery schools. For many, many centuries, even millennia, there have been schools that have privately and quietly taught esoteric principles and truths to those who were ready. Some of the earlier schools that are generally talked about were those in ancient Egypt. These Egyptian schools were attended by many personalities from antiquity, some of whose names you would probably recognize at once if you heard them. The schools in Egypt were preceded by similar schools in Atlantis and so on, further back than we can even speculate. These schools taught their aspirants or their students regarding esoteric matters that were considered as great mysteries by the masses of the people, if the masses even knew of them at all. The schools, over the years, were given many names, but the name by which most people who are familiar with such things know them today is mystery schools. Some of these schools have continued over the years, and there are some that exist today. There are also a number of organizations that may not necessarily be mystery schools in the formal sense, yet they may conduct seminars and or offer teachings and information of various kinds. It should be the personal decision of each seeker whether or not to affiliate themselves with such a school or organization. I can assure you that some have teachings that are very worthwhile, which can be of great benefit as you travel in your journey along life's path. I will mention only a few with which I am somewhat familiar, but there are undoubtedly others, and, as indicated earlier, the seekers must make such decisions for themselves. The school that comes first to mind is that of the Rosicrucian order Amorc, A-M-O-R-C, standing for the Ancient Mystical Order Rosicrucis. There may be more than one Rosicrucian order, but only one may use the term Amorc, as I said, Ancient Mystical Order Rosicrucis, in the name, and that is the one with which I am familiar. They are located in San Jose, California, in the United States at the time of this video creation. I have also heard of a group called the Mayans in South America. There is additionally an organization that was formed on the basis of the readings of Edgar Cayce, called ARE, meaning the Association for Research and Enlightenment. They are located, I believe at the time of this video, in Virginia Beach, Virginia, in the United States. The author makes no recommendations regarding such matters. Once again, this should be each seeker's personal decision whether or not to make such an affiliation, and if so, with whom. With that thought, we will conclude this video in the series. I want to thank you for watching, and I encourage you at your convenience to watch the next video and the subsequent videos in this series. Again, thank you very much.